Small Monday meeting, Collett House, 20th of June, 1977. After a few announcements, DrRoles began as follows. We have got some interesting exploration to do this afternoon on a very important subject which we always thought we knew all about, but which now I'm convinced that we know very little about at all. Exclamation mark. That is something for which there is a difficult name and verbal description, but which as a feeling is very familiar to all of us. It was called in our system identification and considering, quoted and underlined. The subject is further complicated by the fact that the Sanskrit word which the Shankaracharya is using is not understood by either of the interpreters who translate it into English as attachment, quote, which is something quite different. So let us try to be honest with ourselves and take it that we don't understand what is important about this. We know only roughly what it is all about, this thing called identification. But we don't know what in the original explanation is relevant and important to us now, and what can be discarded. We don't know how it differs for each person, for one man's meat is another man's poison, quoted, semicolon. And we don't realize that it is our chief obstacle at the present time, and has to do with the hardening of the heart which takes place within any organization and is associated with any special technique which gives results, such as meditation, turning, or movements. New paragraph. I think the best starting point is this Sanskrit word kasher, K-A-S-H-A, with a long sound over it, Y-A, comma, meaning the sticky aromatic juice of a tree which insects get caught in because they are so attracted to it. In some systems in the East, this word has been used psychologically to signify the fact that the mind gets caught and stuck in. Things from which it can't free itself, like a fly on flypaper or caught in this sticky gum. The difference being that the fly knows it is caught, comma, but the human being doesn't, exclamation mark. Only when we recognize that we have done something silly and wrong, unlike ourselves, or that we have felt this horrid sticky feeling of being identified, and no longer one's own master, comma, do we realize what it was that went wrong? Paragraph. So let us have some examples. I may say that our interest in this has been partly aroused by the actor Anthony Anholt, A-N-H-O-L-T, at the Guards Group, from his point of view of its relation to acting. But we will come to that in a minute. Now I would like Alan to read this example given me by Helen Wright, who was listening to the TV interview with Janet Baker, the singer, last night. Did any of you hear and notice this description of hers? Alan reads, single spacing indented. In an interview on TV last night, Janet Baker described the situation which could happen during a performance if she became too, quote, emotionally involved with what she was singing. It is difficult to cope with because she can't perform properly anything that doesn't move her emotionally. Dr. R. insert, says she is caught in a jam. She can't sing properly unless she is emotionally aroused, and if she is emotionally aroused too much, trouble will follow. And Alan goes on with single spacing quote, if she got too involved, her voice might pack up completely and no sound would come out. It happened once in Vienna, singing a Schubert song, a nightmare situation, full stop. Asked what she could do to avoid this, she replied without any hesitation, quotes, to keep something of myself aside so that it could watch what was happening. Dr. R. repeated, to keep something of myself separate and aside which could watch what was happening. He goes on, this, of course, is very familiar to a lot of people here. Richard Gard, for instance, used often to tell us about how he used to dry up, quote, when he had to give a lecture or make a speech. Of course, he has conquered all that now, exclamation mark. He knows very well what this means, and he has in fact written the following in a letter to me as an account of his conversation with the TV actor Anthony Anholt, who goes to his meeting. Alan reads, single spacing indented. He shares Anholt's query, which boils down to something like this, which arose from the story of the arrow maker. Quote, surely there are different sorts of concentration, quote, concentration, when performing skilled jobs, query, end of quote. and had told Richard Garrett after the meeting that, quote, sometimes while acting he was so immersed in the part he was playing, comma, that he was totally oblivious of anything else, full stop. At other times he was so outside the part that he could watch himself and the audience and note their reactions, comma, and so on. He had no idea which was the better state from the acting point of view. End of quote. But still single spacing. Richard Garrett goes on, colon, again indented, I myself have often experienced being so concentrated on my drawing board that it is quite a surprise to discover, after several hours, that I am stiff with cold. On one famous occasion, some time ago, I threw my rubber out of the studio window and found myself using my lighted cigarette end in its place. Exclamation mark, brackets, laughter. Surely the opposite to the error maker's state. Exclamation mark, end of quote, and indent. Dr. R. Well, this is really good enough to show us the problem. Dash, the difficulty being that all of us are in a different position as regards this obstacle. Some are very deeply affected by it, and particularly with identification with people, which has always been called considering. Quote, considering. I myself have always been a martyr to that, semicolon. Yet other people don't seem to be, to the same extent or in the same way. Full stop. So I would like the old hands, dash, anybody who feels like it, dash, not to give me examples of things with which they are identified, or what form the identification takes with them, but just to tell us what general description or language they find in which to describe it. For the word identification is not very helpful, semicolon, and certainly the word attachment, quote, is not helpful at all. Brackets, to Dr. Peter Pennick, end of bracket, for instance, colon, one psychoanalyst at our new group, comma, Dale Beckett, comma, asked, quote, on the sixth step of the ladder of self-realization, comma, is one required to stop being attached to one's parents? Query mark, end of quote. Next paragraph. Of course, the word attachment in India was always used by the celibate, by the full-timer, to preach to the householder, who is told not to be attached to women and gold, though these are the very center of the householder's life, exclamation mark. So confusion is even worse in India than it is here. Again to Dr. Pennick. brackets. I don't know whether in psychology today you have any equivalent, semicolon. But in Mr. Rupinski's time, he said that Western psychology had bypassed this whole mechanism. I suppose you deal more with individual examples, underline individual, don't you, query? But you have not, as far as I can see, described this as a general and very important cause of many troubles. Dr. Pinnock, it has all got sidetracked onto the Freudian idea of the subconscious without looking at the conscious mind. Dr. R. Yes, semicolon. But even that is a clue, because Dr. Connell here and I are both convinced that identification is a disorder of the autonomic nervous system which operates behind the conscious level. I mean, all its manifestations, at any rate, are autonomic. The dryness of the throat, the goose flesh, the tense and unnatural movements, and the stammering or incoordination in instinctive functions. Question, Colin Lucas. Can you try the idea of how much of one's mind works together on a thing? Dr. R. I'm sure this comes into it, Lucas. Yes, of course so. For instance, I think that while the first obstacle the Sankaracharya is stressing, the Vikshepa, V-I-K-S-H-E-P-A, or, quote, dispersion of the mind, is occasioned by the busy dominant hemisphere, semicolon. But this second one, where some special attraction, where some special like or dislike penetrates into the quiet, inward-looking hemisphere and arouses the autonomic by that route, feels like identification and is accompanied by those physical manifestations we've been mentioning, dash, kashaya. Next paragraph. But if one were brought into the clear by increase of sattva, which brings both those two sides of one's nature together, then one would be free from dispersion and free from identification. This, I think, answers Lucas's question. Do you agree it could be something like that? Colin Lucas. That is what it rather feels like. Dr. R. But the trouble is that it is virtually unknown territory to everybody. The autonomic is unknown territory to anyone who isn't a professional physiologist. The two hemispheres are unknown territory, except the specialists in the subject. So no one knows, except the fully realized man, how the two sides of our nature can be brought together. That's for us identification and all that leads up to it in the way of the man's structure and function is unknown territory. Explanation now. So yet we have to make a beginning somehow. Has anybody got any suggestions? Alan, would you say it is not a disease of the autonomic nervous system, it's the symptoms? Doesn't it come first? Considering is a mental thing, isn't it? The symptom of it may appear in the drying up of the throat, but does it actually originate there? Dr. R. Well, it has always been understood that it arises in the emotional part of one's nature, the autonomic, and one does not become really deeply identified until one is at least slightly aroused emotionally. In brackets, see Janet Baker. End of brackets. One can't get identified just in cold blood. Something that doesn't really come close to the heart. So we tend to be identified in proportion to how much we are aroused emotionally. Dr. R. to Dame Nanette. You must have studied this in dancers. Dame Nanette. Yes, you used the word sense of proportion, which were going through my mind. In my experience, the sense of proportion is essential, and unless people have a sense of proportion, they cannot control their movement. Dr. R. And this is where the director of the ballet or the choreographer has to get everything into the right unity, proportion. Fair enough? Stay in the net. Yes, but it is up to the artist in the end. Dr. R. And what good accounts you've given your latest book, step by step, of how some great dancers you've known well look at and share it. Question. Are we talking about people nowadays, what people nowadays sometimes describe as hang-ups? Dr. R. We are, and much more beside, exclamation mark. We're also talking about what people sometimes describe as first-night nerves, semicolon, and all sorts of conflicts and troubles which appear quite separate, of varying manifestations and uncertain origin, semicolon, but which only appear separate until you realize that they are all connected fundamentally with identification or considering. In this house, in this work, we're not really much concerned with all the fantastic identification that goes on in the world around. I mean, we all know pretty well the hopelessly absurd attitudes and actions that people can develop through being extremely identified in one or another unlikely interest. What we are interested in is in what way it constitutes an obstacle to us on the way to self-realization. Underline an obstacle to us on the way to self-realization. Comma, to the melting of the silver and the juice of the herb, semicolon, and how to get over this danger, dash, this barrier which no, you told us that when we were attempting to think about ourselves, we should think about God instead. Is this a clue to overcoming identification? Dr. R. Well, this is the way suggested to us by the fully realized man, who incidentally is the only person I've ever met who has completely overcome identification. Semicolon. And this is the way he suggests that we avoid it. Dodge it altogether by putting in place of the habitual personal point of view and adopting the point of view which is universal instead. Connecting it with more and more understanding of what he means by paramatma. This is his remedy. That's what you're meaning, isn't it? In brackets, yes. Certainly, a little practice of this will do away with a lot of identification, but we never stick to it long enough. Question, a woman. Is this a function of buddhi? Query. Dr. R. No. It is what prevents buddhi from functioning. Underline, prevents buddhi from functioning. Full stop. His Holiness speaks of buddhi as a state of mind which is only within the range of human beings and not of any subhuman creature, and even in human beings as something very uncommon. A state where the mind is in control of the situation and can make choice as to what is right on this occasion and what is not. Occasionally, ordinarily, we don't have that because we live in a state of identification, more or less deep. So freedom from identification gives buddhi a chance to take its right place as charioteer, or the chauffeur who gets us through the day. Lady Cruet, I really want to know how one accounts for what I call a kind of balance. When I am teaching, I sometimes experience the feeling of I am not there. I am not there. Quote, it is not a conscious effort to remove my I, semicolon, it happens. I should like to know how it happens, and I believe that this feeling of I am not there, quoted, is recognizable as an indication, perhaps, of what we are talking about. Dr. R. Certainly, yes, and it is a very good way to start. Lady Cruet, but I've just retired from teaching, exclamation mark, laughter, bracket. Dr. R, I meant for us to start here and now, dash, to look at it from the point of view of what you want to be, rather than of what you don't want to be. In other words, you value what you used to find when you were teaching. Those moments when you suddenly came into the clear with the feeling I am not there, though they were not the result of any conscious effort. This is the right way to approach it, semicolon, and I will get Alan to read the original description of what is the opposite of inner considering with people, because when you were teaching, those moments that you, to suddenly losing the inner considering, and considering your pupils instead. And considering and studying the interest of your pupils instead. The original description given by Gurdjieff to Mr. Usensky was Alan Reed. The opposite of inner considering, and what is in part a means of fighting against it, is, quote, external considering, underline, end of quote, which is based on an entirely different relationship with people. It is adaptation of one's own selfish desires to an understanding of other people, semicolon, to their needs and requirements, full stop. By understanding the tastes, comma, habits, comma, and prejudices of others, comma, one understands oneself, full stop. An external considering requires a great power over oneself, a great control over the weaker sides of one's own nature. Full stop. End of single spacing, quote. So this was clearly put at the beginning, but never carried out, even by the man who spoke those words. I think you will find that, looking back on those moments that occurred, of being in the clear when teaching, that you had your pupils in mind rather than yourself. Dr. R. to schoolmaster Mr. Buller, don't you think it has something to do with it? In brackets, yes. Dr. R., do you ever consider in your classes, Mr. B, I am normally too busy to do anything but think about the children. Afterwards, one seems to wonder whether one said the right thing. Dr. R., oh yes, but at the time you don't suffer from it in relation to performance. Query. But don't you find that you do not regard all the pupils equally? Aren't there one or two of them with whom you tend to consider, some big lout who is obviously not wanting to learn anything and who just sits and instructs? Query mark. In brackets, he nods. We aren't even in our considering of other people. With some people we consider, and with some we don't. Mr. B, I find the idea of remembering the Paramatman in everything is very helpful, if only I could remember. Dr. Yes, semicolon. But now we're trying to get further back from that. What is it helpful for, Mr. B? If I do it, it gives me a sense of evenness. My attention includes the desks and all the pupils and everything. Dr. Yes. Here, Gary Richardson came in with, quote, my mind wanders, and it wandered when Lord Allen was reading. Could it be read again? Dr. I saw you yawning just now, so felt you were identified with something else, exclamation mark. All right, let us read that bit again, but I think we will go even further back, as the whole idea of identification was originally presented. It was then emphasized that though you could be identified with anything, the thing that everybody is identified with always is their own ego. Here is that account. Aaron Reed, single spacing indent. Identifying is the chief obstacle to self-remembering, full stop. in brackets, Dr. R, self-remembering being remembering the Paramatman or the Atman, the true self, not the false one, end of the bracket. A man who gets identified with anything is unable to remember himself. But in order to learn not to get identified, a man must, first of all, not be identified with himself. So long as a man identifies or can be identified, he is the slave of everything that can happen to him. Freedom is, first of all, freedom from identification. End of single statement. Dr. R. Then he immediately goes on to say that a special form of identification is identification of people, which is called inner considering. And the description, which I'll get Alan to read again at your request, was done. In brackets, repeat reading, beginning first, the opposite of inner considering. Dr. R continues, so I suggest that we start from now, for a time, to fasten our thoughts on external considering in our relations with any other person, whether they are in this work, capital W, or not, semicolon, whether they are in one's family or intimate, or among one's acquaintances, or, in fact, just anybody with whom one has dealings. Dash. Fasten the mind on the desire to consider them externally, that is, without one's own personal feelings intruding. Full stop. Make allowances for their outlook, their point of view, their prejudices, and so on. Semicolon. Not expecting them to do what one can't do oneself. Full stop. For if one is a machine oneself and behaves mechanically so often, one must not expect other people not to be machines. Question, a woman. If one managed to see that this identification was a lack of something, rather than something in itself positive, here Dr. R came in, you mean in this work on yourself, or just in general? Questioner said, oneself. Dr. R, you were saying? Questioner, if one could see it as a lack of something, one would see what it really was. Dr. R, yes, semicolon, and it would not have this power over one. Mademoiselle, colon, does external considering lead to the right action or the right thought? Dr. R, yes, semicolon, and that is very important, for it will prevent you from doing something wrong, taking a wrong step in future, which you would regret. It has come up with me a great deal in connection with the proposed centenary celebration which Yale University is giving next year for Mr. Usinski. One has been asked to take part in it, to write things for it, even to go over and give a talk. etc., etc., semicolon. And I've been so identified with, quote, my mission, that perhaps I've been unnecessarily stuffy about it. If I'd had my attention on what Yale University wants to know about Mr. Uspensky, what would lead to a better understanding for students and lecturers of Mr. Uspensky and his writings, then my small local prejudices about these things wouldn't have counted. However, luckily the situation is still open, and one doesn't want to get too involved, just to be cooperative. Next paragraph. It is in that way, you see, Menzel, if one can see things without identification for a moment, one sees that one was about to embark on a quite wrong course of action. One would pull back just in time. Menzel. One sometimes reacts in a way that other people would not expect from one, through not knowing what is expected from one. Yes, I know. But if you meditate properly, semicolon, if you try to think of the Paramatman and not of yourself, semicolon, it is then, when you put the problem in front of you about this person and see it from their point of view, that it will save you and them from a lot of troubles. Exclamation mark. Colin Lucas. The meditation obviously makes a difference, semicolon, but if one could find out why it makes a difference, perhaps then one would understand more about it. Dr. And I would like to go further. I don't think that in the majority of people, the meditation makes enough difference. It doesn't make the big difference that it has the power to make. Why is that? Perhaps it is that we become identified with ourselves as a good meditator. Dash. This is my meditation, underline my. I am a good meditator. I am not as other men in this respect. Dash. Those poor devils in the outside world who don't have the meditation at all. Look what a mess they get into in the kingdom. And here am I, a meditator. This is what puts me wrong, myself, exclamation mark. But the meditation has brought about this change of point of view in me, for I think it is the reason why there is this lack of both sides of the nature working in harmony with sattva. The meditation works because it brings them into harmony. And this it could do in the first moment, and often does, but then it's difficult to maintain. If we could make more of that, starting with the meditation, by stopping the dispersal of the mind, and allowing the meditation to help in melting silver in the alchemy of happiness, then it would have a marvelous effect on the rest of our life and our activity. Lady Allen, is this really related to the emphasis that the Shankaracharya put on, quote, giving up, semicolon? Because very often one gets energy from the movements or the turning or whatever, but then one seems to embark on some very personal effects. Dr. R. Yes, it is then that one is in danger. It is at one's better moments, say after training or movement or meditating, that one is in danger from identification, losing oneself again. The Shankaracharya is advising giving up. There is never a moment when you can't give up. And what we have to give up is I, one's feeling of I, identification. So I think he is directly referring to what we've been talking about when he speaks of giving up. Other people don't notice the body at all. They seem to be disembodied. And they feel the bad effects in their mental operations, the use they make of their minds, sense of judgment, and so on. Others, again, feel it all in relation to their feelings. It is there that they register the bad effects of identification, through their emotional side. People are very different. And though we quite often see one aspect of identification, we don't see all the others. This trouble of, quote, drying up, or stumbling over one's feet when one comes into a room full of people, are very bad, very extreme examples of identification. But just because we may no longer be subject to those, it doesn't mean that we aren't identified. To Michael McCone. Michael, have you come to any conclusions in relation to what Anne Hope was interested in, namely the effect of identifying as an actor? Mr. McCone's answer, not audible on the tape. Dr. R. Is it always the same? Because sometimes if you forget yourself and play the role spontaneously, the results are good, but at other times not. Mr. McCone, much shortened. It really comes to the same thing, that if you forget yourself, quote, yourself in playing the role, this really leads on to the second stage which you mentioned, where one is aware both of the role and of oneself as an instrument playing it, but with one's attention on the role and the people in the audience. Dr. R. Of course, the whole difficulty is that oneself is the Atma. And this doesn't enter into what one must forget. For what one must forget is something which is parading as oneself. And that is why it's very hard to deal with and to express. The Shankaracharya laughingly said that it is easier to hit a real snake with one stick, but it is very hard to kill a rubber snake which really isn't there, which isn't real. What he calls false eye. False eye, he says, is just an artifact, not a real thing. Then, about painting. I want to ask people who try to paint, and even the professionals who can paint, whether they tend to get identified with what they're doing. And if so, then is the painting good or bad? Mr. Hester, certainly, I agree that they mustn't get identified. Dr. R. But isn't it a constant effort? Isn't a constant effort required to keep painting and not get identified? However one describes it to oneself. Cézanne, for instance, in his description during a conversation with a friend, says that he has to draw all sides of what he is seeing onto his paper, and if he lets himself intrude into this, it is ruined, and he throws it away. Something like that. So, this identification affects all sides of human performance, and the most valuable sides of human performance at that. So, as a study society, surely we ought to understand a bit more about it, semicolon. And indeed, I would be very grateful, Dr. Pennick, if you ever get time to jot down a few suggestions as to how this could be brought into the ordinary field of professional psychology. To be brought back into the teaching on the subject, especially, of course, with psychotherapy in practice, because it would be about the most important contribution which could be made today. Miss Irvin, I remember saying to Mr. Uthensky that I was being identified and aware of being identified and asking how I could stop it. He said that I could not stop it until I knew all about it, all the reasons for it. Dr. R. Yes, and here is, this quotation comes from the report of a meeting with Mr. Uspensky in 1938, where somebody asked, I find it difficult to differentiate between identification and concentration. Dr. I suppose they mean something like the arrow maker in the bracket. Mr. Uspensky replied, you can control concentration, but identification you cannot control. Dr. And this is a very good dividing line, and is the answer to Anhelt's question about the two kinds of experience he has when acting. In one case, he's so immersed that he has no power of control, but in the other case, where he's taking in the audience as well, he can control the situation to some extent. Question. My question really is about the two states of identification, particularly when working on a craft. Semicolon. I find that if I work from the head, I can put myself, the ego, out of the way, semicolon. Then if I drop it, I get the kind of attention of the arrow maker. But if I can control it, hold it in the heart, then the thing will warm up, and the attention seems wider and to embrace more. And I ask, are these different stages in the same process? Dr. R. I believe they are, but not necessarily that one has to follow the other sequentially, SEQUENTIALLY. They seem to need to go together, and some have more control on one side and some on the other. But I should talk to the man just in front of you, sculptor Sean Crampton, about this point, because I have often had interest interesting discussions with him, semicolon, and he would know the answer from the technical side. Lady Allen. In the work of the first Shankara, on which Mr. Amos is working at the moment, there is a verse which says that a man is calm and quiet, whether praised or blamed, and unselfish. End of quote. Dr. R. And there's a whole chapter in the Bhagavad Gita about that, Amos, which you have probably come across, and which seems to have been the source from which the first Shankara took it, first Sri Shankara took it. Dots. Dr. R then concludes, well now, let us drop all our identifications for the moment, and for our last 2 minutes, let's be one. Capital O. Colon. Meditation, comma, meditator, comma, and object of meditation, namely the Paramatma, all one. Meditation for 5 minutes. Afterwards, the thought came to me after this meditation that most ordinary religion, or what is called religion, is inner considering with God, quoted. You create a God in your own image, and you spend all your time wondering what this God is thinking about what you're doing, comma, and even asking, quote, please God, can't I do this rather shady thing, just this once, and get away with it, query mark, end of quote. Whereas real religion is, quote, externally considering God, end of quote. In other words, you ask yourself, what would please the Atman or the Paramatma? What would be in keeping with his plan and his nature? Incidentally, Sarah Stewart at the new meeting suddenly asked, in the midst of a fervent discussion, just saying, quote, couldn't one just be grateful for him, in the quote. And this produced quite an effect on me when I read the account of the meeting. For we're told by the Shankaracharya that this is what pleases God more than anything, just for the individual to be grateful.